Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I've got a conversation for you with my friend Kathryn. I know Kathryn from online participation in the Discord. She's been around these circles for a long time. She ran the Thunder Bay conference. She helped moderate and was part of the Chino conference that just happened in Sacramento. She's been on the Discord and an admin for the Bridges of Meaning Discord for a while now. And she's been featured in a couple marriage crisis conversations on Paul Vanderklay's channel. And she's got a lot of wise things to say about marriage and the generational gap and passing on wisdom. And so I had seen some of her comments online and asked if she wanted to talk with me about that. And I really loved the conversation and loved how vulnerable she was. And yeah, I hope you enjoy what she has to share. Kathryn, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you. Before we get into the conversation, why don't you give a brief introduction to yourself for people who maybe don't know you? Who are you?
Well, my name's Kathryn, and I'm a mom. I've got 3 kids. My oldest is almost 17, and my youngest is almost 13. Just a couple weeks, and we'll be there. So 3 kids, been married for 18 years. I'm a therapist. So right now I do probably half my work is with teenagers, and then the other half of my work is adults. I don't really do family therapy. It's mostly individual work. What else? I'm from Canada. I'm a Protestant. I really like doing things. I'm a big fan of like being in the world. So I like skiing and kayaking and hunting and fishing and running and knitting. So that's probably a pretty good snapshot.
Yeah, a lot of that seems good to be in Canada for all of those things.
Yeah.
It seems like you've got a lot of places to be out and about. As far as your therapy goes, have you always done sort of teens and adults, or is that something that kind of grew out of the time working with people?
Yeah, when I first started, I didn't do much work with teens. And honestly, well, I'll go back a little further. So before I became a therapist, I did a lot of like church ministry. So when I did ministry in the church, I almost exclusively worked with teens. I did a lot of like youth group kind of stuff. Then when I got into therapy, it was mostly adults. I had a couple of teens and kids, but mostly I worked with their parents. And so I would meet with them a little bit, but mostly I would talk with their parents about how to engage with their own kids and how to restructure their home life and that kind of thing. But I recently, within the last year, took on a contract with a group that I predominantly work with kids within that group now. So because of that, I'm doing more work with teens, which is kind of nice to kind of close the loop a little bit again and have more kids. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it works out nicely too, because my kids are up at that age now too. So I'm kind of in it as well as talking to kids that are teenagers. So, and I always find like that helps.
To help. I was wondering, does it make it hard sometimes to have the kids and be working with kids? Does it bring any fears of like, oh, what's going on with my own children?
No, maybe it should. For me, I find it helpful because since I spend a lot of time hanging out and talking with my kids, then I feel like I'm hitting the right conversational level. And it's kind of helps me stay in touch more with like Zoomer culture, like young adult things that otherwise I might be a little distant from, because when I'm talking with my kids, they're chatting about whatever they've been into and trends online and whatever. That kind of translates nicely. Whereas I think I was starting to lose some of that connection because like 20 years ago, when I was doing more of it within the church, I was still so close to that age myself that there was only a few years gap. I feel like I was still a little more in touch with things. I think if I didn't have my own teenagers at this point, the gap would be a little bigger. Yeah. So it does help, I think, to have my own kids kind of shoving youth culture in my face.
Yeah.
So,
But this might be a good segue into sort of what I wanted to talk to you about. I saw online you were commenting a little bit about the generation gap and some of the issues that we're seeing with that. Do you kind of want to explain that and what you're seeing? And yeah, I thought your points were really interesting.
well, I'm happy to talk, but I might not hit the same points because I honestly don't even remember what I said.
That's
So
okay.
I'll just chat. And if there's something that you find interesting, you can kind of get me to drill into it a little more. Um, in some ways, it's hard. It's such a huge topic that it's hard to know where exactly to begin.
Yeah.
And part of it is, I think, even just driven by technology. I mean, I grew up in the generation where dial-up was just beginning to be a thing. My dad he was working as a salesman for digital computers. So we had a home computer as like one of the first people in our province to have like a home computer because he had access to it and whatever. Um, but but yeah, I grew up in the generation where that was just beginning. The internet was just beginning. And so even just the fact that people our age grew up online, um, which is really different from my parents' age, never mind their parents' age.
Yeah.
Like just the technical changes that way have made a big difference in terms of how people relate to each other, how to connect with other people. But to come in from a different angle, I remember, I think I've mentioned this to you before. I remember talking to my mother-in-law maybe 10 years ago now. And she was talking about how when because she had been an atheist, and then she had joined a church when she was in her maybe mid-20s, early 30s, something like that. And so a bunch of the women, when she joined the church, sort of handed off one of their groups to her. And they were like, oh my goodness, we're so glad you're here now. We've been hanging on to this ministry, running it for all these years, just waiting for someone younger to take over. And so we're so glad that you can do it. And she's like, okay, well, like, what am I supposed to do? Can somebody mentor me or guide me in how to do this? And they're like, we have no idea. Nobody told us what to do. So you can figure it out and do it however you want because we don't care. And nobody told us. So that is also an interesting thing where it's like even the generation above me, the generation above them felt like there was a huge gap in what they were given from the previous generation. So that would have been my grandparents' age. Felt like, well, we don't even know what we're doing. And so then I think you get 3 generations lower and you have that much less being handed down generation to generation. Yeah. And so my experience of that has been you have some small close-knit communities where people move forward in life out of their childhood feeling like they have a worldview that is clear and they can articulate, and where they know who they are and how they relate to the other people around them. They sort of have a vision of what their life path should look like, how they would function within that, ways where which behaviors would help them to achieve that life path better and which behaviors would be detrimental to that life path. But other than people in close-knit communities, a lot of those structures that we were just used to be given because of our society, we don't really have anymore. So there's no clarity on what you should do with your life. And even the suggestion that you would tell someone what they should do with their life is like offensive because everyone is supposed to figure that out for themselves. And they're supposed to have an answer that will just sort of spring up unbidden internally based on some intrinsic orientations that they have towards maybe physical interests or artistic interests. And that will just happen so long as you don't oppress that other person with preconceived notions of what they should want. If you can withhold all of that, then there'll be room for this internal sense to grow. And then if you can naturally help them to like direct that, then they'll be able to grow into quote unquote who they are as a person without suppressing it. And so not only do we not really give people a path, there's an aversion to anything that would be close to giving someone a path,
Mm.
which can work out well for some kinds of people. Some people are extremely like clear-minded, disagreeable. They have a clear sense of those things, but that's not most people. Most people are extremely impacted by what the people around them are doing and thinking, which is really good and healthy. Like that is actually the way, like we're social animals. So we are very shaped by other people's approval, their acceptance, which is really healthy. And the people who aren't like that, you have to worry that they're like not psychopaths and going to kill everybody and just use everyone for whatever they want. So it's really good, but it also means that then if you pull back all the guiding principles, the likelihood that people will go into a path that will actually serve them through every stage of their life is really low.
Mm.
And I work with clients regularly who are usually more in their 30s and 40s, who are starting to tackle the fact that a lot of the choices that they made earlier in life don't set them up well for their 60s, 70s, 80s. And they have no real vision of what it looks like to be an adult after 60. They're just like, no real vision of how would I live a life that prepares me to live that well beyond just having money in the bank so I'm not starving. And some people do, for sure, but I run into a lot of folks where they've never even asked the question.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of the like behaviors or actions that they said younger that felt like they didn't set them up for the future? Is it I guess I'm trying to
predominantly what it is not having kids. That's a huge one. So
Mm.
there's a lot of you didn't have children and your friend group split up. People moved on to jobs in different cities, they moved around, and as close as friends can be, it's often less stable than a family, where every Christmas, at least it used to be the way, every Christmas or Easter, there'd be an expectation that family would gather, that if somebody had a major problem in their life, like a spouse would die or there's a house fire or something, family would travel, gather around that person, make space for them in their home, take their children in, whatever was needed.
Yeah.
Family was willing to treat you as if you were an extension of them in a way that friendships, even very close friendships, often don't accommodate that level of personal sacrifice.
Mm.
You can have the rare friendship will for sure be like that, but that's extremely rare. And so the family used to provide that for people, and it also provided you a role so that you had a meaningful purpose in your life. So you would know that, well, as a young woman, I'm going to, usually in the past, support my family through helping around the household, chores, helping with whatever the female designated tasks would be. Then at some point I'll get married, I'll have my own children, I'll train my daughters up to be able to support me in the roles that I'm fulfilling. I'll maybe have a small home business, home industry where I create cloth and sell it or whatever it might be. And I'll train my daughter in how to do that. And then as I get older, I'll do less of that and people will serve me, but I'll teach them how to do things and give advice and how to maybe navigate social situations or whatever.
Yeah.
But you kind of had a clear path of like, I know what I'm moving into, and I have a role in each of those life stages where I know how I'm supposed to participate. Other people will value me if I participate in that way. If I choose not to participate in that way, there will be some social, like negative consequences, which at times were too harsh, which is why a lot of society has reacted against that. But there, in reacting against that, we've lost a lot of the value. Anyways, your question was, what were some of the things? So a big one was having kids, because the family moving forward and aging through the family gave you a role with your descendants as you aged. Another one would be not developing close friendship groups. So instead of having a community where you are self-sacrificially involved in other people's lives in a way that goes beyond just an interest you share, we tend to have interest-oriented relationships. So, you know, if we both like hiking, or if we all happen to like be into the same book series or something, that kind of will prompt a friendship, and then eventually a good friendship will usually grow and you can stay connected. But that's not the same as having people that you invest in a meaningful, self-sacrificial way that you can carry forward throughout life. So we tend to be somewhat more sort of transitory even in our friendships. And I think part of that is the internet, and the fact that we travel so much more for work than people used to. You can get a job across the other side of the country or in a different country, and you'll move for that job. Whereas in the past, you'd be less likely to move so far. And if you did move, you probably were only moving one time in a significant way throughout your life, and then you'd settle and establish there.
Yeah.
And I think just the fact that if you can't find someone around you who connects with you, you're like, well, then I'll just find people online, because there's these other people I really connect with who share my interests and values. And in some ways that's great, because then you can have people who share your nerdy interests, and you can talk about trains or whatever your manga is, or whatever, and you can find your people. But then that also means you're less likely to be socialized into the people who are physically around you. So then you become more socially isolated where you are, and you tend to live more online, which isn't necessarily negative, but we haven't had the internet long enough to figure out how that ages. Yeah. It just came around when I was growing up, and I'm in my 30s. So how does that look if most of my friends are online when I'm 75? Nobody knows, because we haven't done it yet.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the patterns, they resonate with me. I haven't lived in the same place for more than 3 years in the last 10 years. And, I've seen the way that technology has created a lot of these, this sort of fear of missing out and this sort of mindset of taking on the world and challenging it and exploring. And that comes with some of the globalization too, of we see all of these different places of the world, and we feel like unless we go and we see it and we taste it, we're missing that thing of what it is to be the human experience. And there's certainly something that comes with that. Yet, yeah, there is this cost that comes hand in hand with that, in this idea of, hey, the family and that structure. It's very hard to build that if you're also doing this thing. Yeah, I don't know. And it's interesting. I mean, for me, it's I'm 30 now. And, I've married, I've settled down, I'm moving towards the more traditional path. But it's so odd. I've always been sort of that modern trad. I lived a very modern lifestyle in many ways. I worked in entertainment. I traveled quite a lot. There were lots of things that were very modern about myself. Yeah, there was other traditional part, the very religious and grounded part, that there was a seriousness and that hope for the family, the kids, and all of those things. So it feels like there's that dichotomy in myself where I see everybody wrestling and trying to understand, well, what does it mean to, what does it mean to have a good life? And I think for women, it's particularly difficult, because there's that battle of hey, do you build the career and be the strong, independent woman that Western culture tells you is important? Or do you find that way to sort of settle down and commit? And is there this role in the middle? Because there's so many people like myself. I never felt particularly traditionally feminine in the way that, these trad wives people were. I'm just not that person, yet there was that other part of me that knew the importance of that. And yeah, so it's that wrestling and that understanding of well, what should we not throw out? But what should we, because you can't go back to the way things were 200 years ago, right? There's so much has changed with technology that it doesn't make sense anymore to do that. It wouldn't be probably feasible to do that. But yeah, there is this idea of the technology and it changing so fast that we can't even sort of keep up to know how to pass it on.
Well, what would you say that that you feel like there's been a gap in what you wish would have been handed down to you by parents or aunts or?
I mean, for myself, I think I had really great parents. And so they did their best to kind of instill in me the things that they found important. And they raised me in a tradition that went to pass on. And I'm a pretty driven person myself. I'm more of that sort of disagreeable, clear-headed person of like, I know what I want and I go for it. And so, you know, when I was looking for advice, I would try to find it wherever I could. And, you know, I had not only family, but people in church communities and other communities within where I was to help me with that. I think getting older and living life and going out and spending more time on the internet than I wish I would have. Although, you know, good things came from it. Yeah, I think there's something in me that wishes that we found a way to at least like try to understand and connect back to where we came from and why we're here, instead of just like, here, this is what you should do, you know, this is what to believe and how to go about your life. And in more of the trying to understand, well, why? How did we get here? Why was this thing in place? And I also think, yeah, just more, well, maybe this isn't something I wish I had more of, because I actually think I did get this without it being explicitly moved towards, but yeah, just that ability to see the beauty in some of these older patterns and the beauty in like the human connections and that fostering of others, instead of sort of like you said in that story, handing it off and washing your hands clean of things. Like, where's the beauty in the messiness of taking on that suffering and that responsibility of being in community, whether it's family, friends, or what have you? I think that's sometimes missing, because it just is like, well, why would I have kids? See these, like, heard people talk about these TikToks where these young women have lists in their phone about all of the horrible things that comes with having kids. It's like, it's not the whole story, is it? It just feels like we're missing some of that beauty in like the grander narrative of what people are saying.
And I think I agree with you. I think that part of what would give answer to that in the past was we were told what, because the thing is, having kids is a huge sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
And it's a sacrifice that you are committed to for the rest of your life, if you're going to do it well. There are some people who choose to ditch it at a certain point, and universally those people are recognized as bad parents. But to one degree or another, you step into a role that requires putting yourself lower on the totem pole of importance. And the more kids you have, the more intense that experience becomes, because there's more people whose needs come before you. And different cultures would have different narratives to explain why, but we used to have different reasons for why that made sense. In our culture, we don't have that list really, because what our culture says is that personal development, exploration, realization, the development of yourself is your best ultimate goal. And children only have a place in your life if they make that goal happen. If they will help you to self-actualize, then it's reasonable for you to have children. So we have to justify you being a good parent based on how it will make you a better person and how you will become more fulfilled and how you will become whatever. and the wonderful beneficial experiences that you will have, because in our culture, that is the highest good. Which kind of cuts at cross purposes, because yes, and I mean, if you've watched my videos with Paul Vanderklay, you can talk that way about it because it will give you those things. You can come at it from this sort of like cut and dried, let's just talk about the personal benefits of marriage and children. And there are many, and it is good for you in a sort of scientific, people are measured throughout time sort of way. There have been studies, and it's good for most people most of the time to have children and to be married. But it's one of those things where it's like you said, if you dig into it, it kind of kills the beauty of the thing. It's like describing sex in like scientific language. You're like, and now it's not sexy. That like you just killed it. Thank you. Now I don't want to hear about it anymore because you killed it. And it's the same thing where if you look at parenting or marriage or any of these self-sacrificing roles with a more cut and dried lens, you kill the whole thing from the outset, and you remove all of, not all of the beauty, but you cut it down to its most base element. And so you're like, yeah, I guess so. But that feels like, if you take the story of like a heroic warrior who like serves his nation and is brave on the battlefield, and you're like, well, yeah, but he was told he'd get $100,000 at the end of each month, and he was given it, and that's the only reason he did it. You're like, even if that was true, if that becomes the motivation for it, you've destroyed it from the outset, and now it's not heroic. All of the moral beauty and the ethical beauty is removed if the motivation becomes, well, I'll have kids and it'll help me self-actualize and I'll become a better person and I'll feel more fulfilled and I'll have more meaning in life and blah, blah, blah. You're like, yeah, those things are true. And they're supposed to be products that come from a higher path. And if you pursue the product instead of the higher path, it loses its essence.
Right. It's like in the wrong orientation, right? Because it's like, if you pursue the path with earnestness, despite, knowing that there's no guarantee, because there are some children that are easier than others. There are some marriages that are easier than others. There's no guarantee that that's going to lead to all of these benefits, right? But there's that trust of like, if I can be earnest in this and participate well, there's a high chance I'll get those benefits. But yeah, it's something. Yeah, that's where I've sort of, I don't know how to fully describe it yet, but I've started to lose a lot of patience is the wrong word, but like I've started to kind of get frustrated with the way that people try to promote marriage and it's talked about, where it's like, oh, it's fluffy and nice and all these beautiful things, and it feels like very surface level, where it feels like there's something far deeper going on here than just the exchange that we have with costs and benefits, like there's, I don't know. And I think part of this has come to of like trying to understand more of, well, what is marriage? And to me, it's like, right, often we talk about it in this legal framework and it gets so politicized, but it seems like throughout history, marriage has always been a spiritual path, independent of whatever tradition you come from. There's some spiritual path that people were, appealing to. Now, different religions probably have different senses of what that path is and what the point of it is, but I'm Christian, so I look into the Christian path and this idea of when two others come together, it teaches us what it is to be more human, and we can more fully express the fullness of not only humanity, but like this picture of what it is to be divine and participate in those things. And to me, that's like so complicated and beautiful that it seems to cheapen it when you start talking about, yeah, well, higher, more stability, You'll have somebody to help you when you're sick. Like, those are all things that are true, but I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Because, and you can feel free to tweak this or disagree with me if you want. But in my understanding of Christianity, the vision of what it means to be properly human is to be fully oriented in love towards God and therefore other people, and to participate in the divine order as a conduit of the Spirit of God, which means a self-emptying and filling yourself with the nature of God so that you can pass that on to others, which will inevitably look somewhat different for each person because we are individuals for a reason. We're not all clones. It's supposed to look different for each person. But the essential nature of the pinnacle of human embodiment is to be a conduit who participates in the divine dance. And so you just aren't that when you come out. You aren't born that way. It comes through a life of choosing that path, where you choose in more and more intense ways to put aside yourself and to take on what you understand to be the divine will in the moment and choose that path, whatever that looks like. And it will look a million different ways because people live different lives and there's different demands placed on them, different relationships they're in. But my understanding of Christianity is that that is the pinnacle of not even spiritual achievement, spiritual participation, because it's never like you've achieved and you're done. It's an ongoing dance. So you have to continue to participate in that way. And sometimes you can, manage to participate that way for a moment and then you lose it. Some people are very holy and they can live that way for years, but your goal is that type of lifestyle. And so when you realize that that is the end goal, then marriage and parenting make sense within that, because that is the manner in which you are self-donating. And it tells you how to participate within those relationships. And then as a result, if you are with someone in a marriage who also has that vision, you're going to have more of the things that we talk about, which are sort of the cyclical benefits of stability and financial strengthening over time as compared to being single and blah blah blah. If you have these things, but if that becomes your goal, whatever your goal was for what you would achieve within the marriage, that's the sub goal: sexual satisfaction, financial stability, emotional stability. If that becomes your goal, then you will end up sacrificing the greater pattern to maintain that, which will inevitably break the whole thing down. And so whenever you have one of the results become the thing you want, it's going to break the system over time. So it has to be subordinated to this higher vision so that you can live properly within it, and the thing that you actually want will come to you. But if you pursue that thing, it won't come to you, which is like the way basically everything is.
Yeah. So how do you feel the divorce rate and sort of the more commonality of that is affecting this pattern? Like, do you feel like that might be one of the reasons we're having this struggle with that generational handoff, in the sense of what to do next? Rate? Yeah. Well, because I mean,
I think the divorce rate makes it worse.
Yeah.
I think it makes it worse, but I think the reason we have the divorce rate is because we had a cultural breakdown generations ago. So I think because that pattern I was just talking about stopped being the inherent understood goal of each human life, that was what you were trying to achieve. And obviously that was not universal. Other cultures will have a slightly different goal. Like you said, that's my understanding for what the Christian goal was. Notably, I think a lot of more collectivist Asian cultures, the goal is much more to honor the ancestors, to build the family. So there's other ways to get to stable, family-oriented societies throughout time. But I think that is the Christian path that led us to where we are. But I think that vision in the West broke down a while ago, and it became a much more secular humanist vision of self-actualization based on whatever you consider that to be. And so then that led to a divorce rate, and that vision has been taken up almost completely by the church as well. And so that's why I think you have a similar vision or similar numbers of divorce within and without of the church, because you're plagued with the same problem, which is that you don't actually have that vision of what submission to God looks like and the desire to achieve that. I almost never hear of anyone in my personal life or like people, internet celebrities or whatever. You never hear people talk about their desire to be like submitted to God. Sometimes, but often it goes along with people where I'm like, I don't like the way they're living it out. But even just that as the goal is rarely the case. And for people who do talk that way, they tend to be more fundamentalist in their approach, which I find off-putting. And so you either have people who do see that the vision is a whole life of submission to God, and they're fundamentalists, or that's not their vision and they're not fundamentalists. And so I personally find myself, it's difficult for me to find people who I find I can be in full agreement with most things, because it's either one of those two camps, and I don't feel like I fit in either of them. So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Submission has become sort of a dirty word. Yeah, but I think it's just far more complicated on the surface than the caricature that it's become, or at least like the goal of it at the core.
Yeah. Well, because I think it's a misunderstanding of what that actually means, because often submission to God would mean not following along with what your parents want you to do, with cultural mores, with your own desire to let yourself off the hook to be less than you could be. Like there's a lot of things that people assume that looks like, that it doesn't look like that. It's just, we have a very unhealthy vision of what submission to God would look like. Usually they think, well, that means that you like check your brain at the door and you just follow a list of rules and you live a horrible life you never wanted to live, so that maybe you don't go to hell. And that's really not what the vision of submission to God is. The idea is that you see that there is, again, it's back to this idea that you are designed to be a conduit of the Spirit of God in the world here. And that what that means is that you use everything that you can to participate in the dance of life. So you enjoy the world around you. You're fully present where you are. You delight in the things that are enjoyable in front of you. You're really present with the people that you talk to, and you're genuinely working to see that connecting with them is one of the highest goods, and that in that connection to move that both of you closer to God through how you engage, how you talk about things, to move attention towards the things that are good and beautiful and true and lovely, and away from the things that are ugly. And that as you do that, that is the service to other people. And so the vision of what submission to God would look like is, I think it has been mischaracterized for a long time, because a lot of people wanting to use that idea for personal power have twisted it so that they can control other people, which then of course is going to leave a legacy of people thinking, well, that's just a way to be manipulated and used, and that is a dead path. And if it is just so that you will do what other people tell you they think you should do, is what they think submission to God is, then yeah, it's a dead path, because it's not personal. So yeah, it's a dirty word.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people think of like 1950s oppression, right? Which how much of that narrative is actually what was happening in the 50s? I don't know, right? Like it's probably much more complicated than we like to say in our modern frame. But I like the idea of I was thinking about this the other day, like this idea of submission and dancing. It's like, if you've ever been ballroom dancing, it's like you've got a leader and a follower. And like the man is traditionally the leader, right? They lead, the woman follows. And it's not to be oppressive or to hurt you. It's the recognition that if two people are trying to lead, it's never going to work. You're going to stumble on each other's feet. You're going to be moving around. Like you have to like lead and respond. And the best dance partner, they lead, but they lead with you in mind so that you can create this beautiful dance and work together in those things. And I think in life, when I frame it in that way, sort of, and it's submission to God is probably more complicated than that example, but there's something about the idea if we go and do everything on our own terms without submitting to something, well, we're unconsciously going to submit to something, and it might be a lot worse. But there can't be that operation of like the good and the beautiful if we're all just in control, doing whatever, not working in an order of an operation.
Well, because in your analogy, the submission to God would be the fact that you're both dancing.
Yes.
Like submission to God would be, there's a pattern that we are participating in. And of course, if you don't participate in the dance, then it obscures the beauty because there's no dance anymore. You decided to make toast and he's cleaning his gun. Like there's no dance happening. You're both doing your own thing.
Yeah.
Or even if whatever. But in the analogy, it's the dance itself is the pattern of God that you're submitting into.
Right. Where it's like,
which means that him as the leader is also submitted to that pattern.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, you have to have that trust, like to blindly to submit to something, particularly against your conscience. Like, I don't think that's what people are talking about when they're saying submit to God, but it's like that trust of like, this is what I believe, like God is asking of me, or at least, what I feel. And do I have that trust that that ask is not to put me in chains, but to take me on this dance and to operate in the world that creates something beautiful. And I don't know, I just feel like so often we don't talk about that. We talk about it in this order of good. It's a good thing to do, like especially marriage. I grew up, non-denominational Protestant. So you grow up, it's good to get married, and you want to get married really young so you don't have sex outside of marriage because that's really bad. But then, get married and have as much sex as you want, doesn't matter. And yeah, that's great. And that's the benefit of like, yeah, when you get married, that's what you can have. And gosh, I understand why it's talked like that. I understand like the good intentions behind that, but it's not the full story, and it's not the most beautiful thing. And I think it's really hard when you're told all of these other cultural stories that the exact opposite is beautiful. That can be very compelling, even though a lot of times those stories are, like you said, they're not seeing the generational patterns of what that could lead to. Because like we're experiencing patterns of a breakdown generations away from us, but how much of our actions and the way that we're participating is going to do the exact same thing 3, 4, 5 generations down the line. I don't know. It's like very tricky, and it's like finding your balance, the right balance, in the right way of like, well, how do you recognize this pattern break and this gap? How do you fix it? I don't know if you can fix it, but how do you not continue the same pattern? Like, how do you stop the pattern of death and move towards that life?
Well, of course, I have lots of opinions, so I'm happy to answer it. But what do you think? What have you thought so far?
Yeah, well, I think for me, part of it is just being willing to accept a simpler life and like learn how to find the beauty in even the smallest things. And the recognition that, you know, what I'm entering in is, you know, especially for a while, I didn't know if I would get married. And then, you know, at 28, I sort of realized it's probably not better for me to be alone. So if I'm going to get married, I at least need to start trying to find somebody, right? Like, and you know, luckily it happened and it was beautiful and all of those things. But it took some orienting myself in the realization of like, hey, to enter this path, you're going on an adventure and you're tethering yourself to another person. And it's a treacherous mountain to climb. Yet there's beauty within that adventure. And there's I mean, I think for a long time there was a fear of like when you tie yourself to someone, you gain the good and the bad. And so there's that heaviness of like you don't want to make that choice flippantly. Yet that beauty in the recognizing when you can go together in the right mindset towards something beautiful, towards that adventure, those people you're tethered to actually have the ability to help you and support you and show you more beauty. And so it's finding these little ways to kind of like practice the beautiful. And then I think another part is just really trying to get more settled in-person community. I mean, the last 3-4 years, we've been doing this estuary thing and it's online and that's great. And there's been so much good from it. I mean, I found my husband from it, so I can't be too negative about the thing that came from it, but having experienced all that, knowing the limitations of what it is to try to create a global community. It has its downsides. And so finding that way to make my house that home where people know like it's a place to come for those things that sometimes require like sacrifice and suffering. Because like me and Ferdy have been talking about it a lot too, where this idea of the nuclear family, like there's a lot of benefits to that mom, dad, and the household and kids and having that stay together from till the end, right? Yet it's still limited in the frame of like, if you don't have that nuclear family embedded in some bigger community, you're much more likely to fail. And when you spend so much time trying to keep it insular, which is very big in the West because we're very independent, we don't want to show weakness, we don't want to burden other people in this cultural frame. But when you do that, you multiply your sufferings and you diminish the blessings. And if we have learned to open up and find that community and connection and that sort of orientation of love with others outside of just that nuclear family, but also trying to keep this thing together. Like, yes, you're going to experience suffering from others. You're going to have to sacrifice for others. Yet the burdens as a whole become lighter and the blessings get shared more. And I mean, I don't know exactly how that's all going to work in practicality, but those are the things that I've sort of been thinking about of like, how to create that? And I know those sort of patterns of what have been helpful for me and my own path in life and trying to figure out this world we live in. But I don't know, what are your thoughts? You probably have more succinct and helpful thoughts than myself.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think that something implicit in what you were saying that you didn't say directly is, because your question is like, how do you, now that there's been this gap, how do you know which way is good to move forward? How do you find that new pattern? And so implicitly in what you're saying is there is a lot of older traditional patterns that you've decided are probably valuable. Maybe not in the form you received them, but in some form. So the idea of having a close-knit family, that you would value a marriage, that you would value having children, that you would value that grouping being embedded within a larger group, and that acknowledging that all of that will be a mixture of benefit and difficulty, but that the benefit, either personally or communally or to your children or in some way, to some person in some manner, outweighs the cost and is better than the cost. And that somewhere in all of that, there is beauty. And that building and supporting and maintaining that beauty is valuable. It's sort of implicitly your starting point, is that those things are true. There's some truth in these patterns. They're not arbitrary patterns. These patterns exist for a reason. And for you to live life how you want to, or the best, or however you might phrase that, but there is benefit to you, or in who you want to be, or in how you want to live, to figure out how to bring those patterns into life in a modern world with a modern family and a modern marriage, because you don't have any other choice. You can't go back 300 years. This is, you are 30, married in modern Western society. And so you can't just plug yourself into some like ancient village with a church in the middle and everybody goes to church together and you have this like nice little structure that you know how to participate in. It's going to be with modern problems, modern realities, modern solutions, because it's not just that. There's lots of good too, but implicitly there's an acknowledgement that there are patterns that are better than others. You have the capacity to filter some of those and figure out which patterns are good and not good. And that intentionally engaging in that process and then choosing to rebuild some of the patterns that you don't have naturally occurring in your life, but you see as so valuable that you want to build for yourself and your family. I think that's the starting point, is you have to pull back and say there is a good and a bad path. Or maybe there's some good and some bad paths, but there are some things that are better than other things. And I have the capacity to figure that out. And part of how I'm going to do it is by looking at the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a little bit easier now being Orthodox, in the sense that they're always looking to the past, and there is much more of a roadmap, or sort of a built sense of like tradition that you can sort of appeal to. But in that same breath, it also becomes harder, because all of a sudden I'm not taking on the path and traditions that I was born in. I'm embedding myself in a whole different culture and having to like wrestle with the idea of what is this participation? How do you do it well? And how do I learn to take that on, while also feeling sort of like an infant in it? It's like, I'm still like, yeah, there's like that childlike, innocence and ignorance with it all, where it's like, I know these things are helping me and beneficial, but I don't know the right orientation and the proper like orienting of myself. And there is that sort of culture shock, and that how would you say it, that learning curve that comes with taking on this different tradition. Yet like in some ways there's a helpfulness that I did come from a Christian path before. There's a lot of connection between the two, and there does feel something sort of nice about not feeling cut off to like the root of things flowing down, and having that community that keeps looking to the past and not operating with an assumption that ancient people were stupid and they don't have anything to teach us. Yeah, I don't know.
I think the other thing you said that is really, really important is um, moving the scope of your focus into what's in front of you. I think part of the lure of the online world is that we can tend to take on the concerns and the needs and the traumas of everything we bump into online.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, that's multiple hours a day of what we're bumping into online. But to move your attention to how can I be present where I am with the people I'm with and attend to the room I'm in and the day that I have. And narrowing your focus of attention allows you to see what the pattern is where you are, which is almost universally for all of us. Some people are very powerful, but for almost everyone, that's actually the scope of control you have, is the room that you're in, the day that you're in. And anything you try to push beyond that is speculative at best. And so, like you said, to enjoy the things that you're doing, to see the beauty in what's in front of you, to attend to what's right there. I think a lot of that, building up that kind of engagement, which most of us find very hard to do, because when you do that, you have to engage and be fully present with yourself. And a lot of people find that very uncomfortable because we have flaws and failures and have made mistakes. And you have to be able to not be running from those things within yourself. But as you're able to engage in that way in the space you're in the day you're in, your sense of how to begin to inhabit those older patterns in a modern life will begin to sort of build themselves naturally. Because it's very hard to see what is actually beautiful if you can't bring those things together, because beauty is a sense of the aesthetic patterning of things in a way that is complementary and harmonious. And if you can't be within yourself, within your space, you can't see how that would happen in front of you. So you didn't walk all of that out exactly, but I think your point of enjoying the small things and being present where you are very powerful points.
Well, it's not it's not my natural inclination. I'm very much like a sort of visionary thinker. I want to think 10 years down the line, and what do we do to get there, and how do I manage myself? And so, for the first time in my life, I'm sort of at a crossroads of like, I have no idea what I want in 10 years. And so there's that forcing of having to sit and just be like, well, enjoying the beauty of now. And yeah, I think there is something in me that wants to try to cultivate that more, where yeah, I have more of a sense of the present and the beauty that lies in my everyday, in the room that I'm in at the moment, and not 12 steps from now. But I don't know, and maybe it's just like the life that I was brought up, the culture I was in, but it feels like there's a lot of people kind of looking ahead, trying to predict for then, instead of finding that beauty now and like the small steps along the way. I mean, for you, how have you done it within your life and your marriage? Like, where have you found the beauty? What has been helpful for you in capturing some of those patterns?
Well, I would say until 6 years ago, I was sort of chronically depressed. And that was probably the way I'd been for 20 years before that. So I was able to move it out into my marriage only after I resolved what I needed to personally. And a lot of that process of moving from depression into a place of, joy, was moving my attention into the present moment and learning how to, because for me, a lot of what I experienced it as was a lot of ruminating thoughts. It was a lot of a combination of sort of remembering things I had said and done or had been said to me that were painful and sticky, and it was hard to drop. And then sort of the resulting, when you have your brain speaking to you and it's just kind of beating you down, sort of that side of things. And so it was that pattern of sort of the ruminating thoughts and the trouble pulling myself out of my head and into the day that was in front of me. That was very hard. And I could, turn it off for work to a certain degree or whatever. Like I was functioning as a professional and had gotten several degrees. Like it wasn't debilitating in life, but it was emotionally overwhelming. So for me, I think the first thing that I had to learn was how to attend to what was right in front of me. And it was my focus on caring for other people that allowed me to have the desire to even want to do that, because I didn't have another motivation at that point, except to want to be, for me at that point, a good mother who could be attentive and present and not emotionally absent for my kids. But the pathway to becoming an attentive, emotionally present mother was learning how to pull my attention into the moment and intentionally not think the things that were unhelpful, which is fairly technical, and I could go into it at some point if you want, but essentially it's a practice, and it's a practice of mental control and choosing that path. But then once I had practiced that path for some time and I was in the habit of being in the day and in the moment for as long as I could maintain it, and then pulling myself back into it as frequently as necessary, that set me up to be able to then see what was in front of me. Because at first, when you start down that path, you can only see a very small amount of what's in front of you. And it's kind of like anchor points that you hook yourself into so that you can stay there. So at first, it might just be attending to the immediate emotional state of my kids. But then over time, you're able to expand what you're attending to in front of you. And through that process, then I was able to see the beautiful things within my marriage and attending to the things that I did see as beautiful. And mostly for me, that would have been highlighting and enjoying the good character of my husband. So instead of ruminating on regrets, ruminating on the things I valued about him and the things he had done. And not like I would spend hours thinking about that, but I think that was how I built more of an awareness of the beautiful things within my marriage. And then meditating on what I loved about him and his character flowed into motivation to want to attentively care for him, which I don't think I was an uncaring wife, but it certainly helps you to be a more generous and more loving spouse if you are conscious of the things that you value and find beautiful in your spouse. I think I also, despite the fact that I was chronically depressed for a long time, I always have really valued playing. Like I like to play. And if there's going to be something that I can set aside my various internal obsessions for, it will be to play with somebody. And so being able to find people to play with, like for me, I would consider this conversation play. Like you're throwing ideas back and forth. This is how adults play, right? They throw ideas around. They push on patterns and see what you can create out of it. People that I could play with conversationally that always helped me too, to shift out of a more self-absorbed space, because you can't really play well with somebody if you're just thinking about how they view you and what they are gonna, how they'll judge you based on your answer. What all those kinds of like self-analytic thoughts, they cut you off at the knees before you even get anywhere. So I think enjoying play and enjoying finding a new pattern with new people, because every conversation partner has a new pattern to kind of get into. That was another thing that helped me to sort of see and enjoy the beauty of what was in front of me. Yeah, one more thing that kind of pulls me out of my own head.
I mean, was there anything specifically that kind of triggered that 6 years ago, where all of a sudden, like, you started being intentional about these practices, or was it just sort of a natural path that is sort of led there?
Well, what kind of triggered it was I'd gotten more depressed than I'd ever been before. So I had to get more serious about addressing it. Is I had been more depressed, like I had been depressed throughout, but I'd gotten to the point where I was having like cognitive issues because I was so depressed. Like I would open the freezer and be like, I have no idea what I would need to do to make a meal. Like I can't even think of what the things would be that I could put together to create a dinner. Like, so I just cognitively was at a new low point. And so for me, it became more like I realized how urgent it was for me to address the problem instead of just coping and sort of being like, oh, well, this is my problem and I'm not happy, but this doesn't have to affect anyone else. I can sort of make it still work for them, and it doesn't have to be hard on them. To realizing, no, actually, if I don't figure this out, then everybody will suffer. So I should deal with this, because if I don't, it won't fix itself. Yeah, and I mean, I had been in therapy for a while at that point, and so not only had I come to a point where I realized I had to really deal with things, but also I had had enough helpful conversations that I had a good framework to understand why I was in the emotional state I was in. So then I had been able to sort of sort through some of the things I believed that weren't true or weren't helpful. And mostly those things had to do with how I related to other people, which is usually the case. But I had done some of that sort of background framework, how do you see the world kind of work already. And I was realizing how, or I was coming to a new level of like, this is hard for other people. So I think the combination of those things probably is what got me to a place where I was able to like dig in and make some changes. And
so what was like the practical things that you did, like when you were first starting to kind of try and start this practice? Because I think often, you know, when you get to a low, or you're dealing with something, or you want to be somewhere else, there's so many like you want the quick fix, but a lot of times it's just the little steps at a time, and like the willingness to take those things. So you're at this point where you're cognitively, you know, at a loss for yourself. What did those first steps look like very practically for you?
well, I am fairly religious in my orientation. So I kind of hit like that low point I was describing, where it's like I can't figure out a meal. And I had a verse come to mind, which was, he has shown you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Is in Micah. And it kind of like struck me as a flash. And I was like, okay, if that's what God requires of me, then that's all I have to do. And if he requires it of me, he'll also give me what I need to do it. So that simplifies things. So I decided I was just going to go through that order and then just keep repeating it. So I was like, okay, what would it mean for me to do justice right now? And I decided that I would make it really super simple and be like, I would bring order to the world. So I think I like swept my kitchen or something. And then it was like, okay, I need to love other people. So then I sat down beside my daughter who was coloring. I was like, I can't really engage with her at all, but I can sit here. And I think she would feel loved if I just sat with her. So I did that for a little while. And then I was like, okay, so then how am I going to be humble? And I was like, well, I feel pretty humble right now since all I can manage is like sitting on a chair and sweeping. That feels pretty humble. And then I went back to the beginning again. And I was like, okay, so then what would I do that would bring order? And I just kind of went through the pattern until like a couple hours later, I was like, oh, I think I can figure out a meal now. Like my mind had kind of settled. And so for me, that became a pattern that was very practical that I could work my way through. Whereas like when I'm emotionally lost, I can hang on to sort of this core of if I can please God by the end of the day, then that's good enough. Even if I don't accomplish anything else that I would value when I'm in my right state of mind or other people would see as valuable. If at the end of the day, God's pleased with me, then that's enough for me. Mm-hmm. And so then I say, okay, well then I'll just go through this pattern and just live in this pattern until I'm sort of cognitively clear. And it was sort of this almost like hyper-focused state with sort of like this background buzzing of like emotional pain. But the practical would be that. And then learning how to just through that practice have that same kind of single-minded focus at other times when I was feeling overwhelmed. You kind of, as you do it, you know how it feels internally. And you have learned the practice of, I feel a lot of intense, overwhelming emotions, and I have part of my brain just like talking away. And I'm just going to put those on. Like you can never make those things go away when you're really depressed, but you can turn the volume down and sort of let them live in the background and choose not to attend to them as much and choose to put your conscious attention on other things and learn to tolerate those other things as just existing. And so I think as I learned to do that with a very clear structure when I was being pushed to the edge, it gave me more room to bring that experience when I was less overwhelmed.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I just, yeah, there's something kind of beautiful in just the simplicity of it. The little moments and like I know there's so much expectation or this like perceived expectation. And like, yeah, I do think like zooming in and the recognition of like, there are all of these little small things that you can do to like find that pattern of like, what does it look like to have justice? Or what does it look like to, you know, bring order or all of these things. And like, they compound on each other in this way that I think, I don't know, that it's like far more beautiful than the like the grand the grand gestures or like the mountains people get to the top of. It's like, you know, you see them at the top, you don't realize that even those people took those little moments to do those things. And yeah, no, I just thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. I think that if you kind of bring the conversation back to the beginning a little bit, I think because we live in an online world, it's easier to believe that we need to be these like internationally remarkable people because we're in touch with all of people from around the world, and you have global news and people talking about like, oh, these patterns that are like whatever, and there's like these huge patterns that we see and can participate in now that we didn't used to have access to before as just average people.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I think that there can be a lot of pressure to feel like that's the level we have to live at. And I personally enjoy being aware of those things, but I can't live in that level. Like, I really can only live, like when we hang out, I'll be in my living room and I'll have today. And so it's like, well, what can I do today that would be valuable? And what's in front of me right now that I can enjoy? And not just because like, oh, I'm so desperate for something that will like make me feel better, but because that's where all of life actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And all the rest of the other things, it's an illusion.
Yeah. Well, and I think often we don't enter the conversation in those sort of higher level international sort of view. Like it comes with so much cost. Like I don't really think I don't envy the people who have this great esteem or fame. It's quite difficult. And yeah, and I mean like that's one of the reasons why with what I do here, I just like talking to normal people because I think there's so much to learn from people who aren't always on a stage, right? They're often living life in a way and embodied in a way that you can't do with like you're promoting something or built or worried about the frame in which you're seen on this like international scale. And so yeah, there is something beautiful about switching that focus and the recognition of like, hey, there's so much beauty in the small scale thing, this bigger picture, shiny, whatever, that there's an attraction to it. But how much of that attraction is feeding the most distractible part of ourselves and like opens us up to, having to fight the worst parts of our humanity to survive that sort of life. It's very difficult. And so finding that beauty in those moments. And that's why I think, yeah, the idea of like the family has become much more appealing to me. And like, for me, it's like I'm 30, so I'm still young. But having kids now is very different than my sister who had kids when she was 21. And I couldn't have done it any other way, right? Like I needed everything that came before to get here and embrace this life with the proper aim. And so I think it's like in some ways a great mercy that I did not marry before. Yet I also know like that's going to come at a different cost of what it's like to, have a kid when you're older. And it's just a different frame. But there's a beauty in it too, though, knowing that there are people in my life who've done different stages and like finding that way to like build that community, to have that space to kind of survive it. And like, yeah, I'm grateful that I'm having that category shattered and that reframing happening now. Because I don't know, like if I had kids when I was 24, which is what I, that was like what I wanted, right? 24, 26, have a kid, right? I don't know if I would have had the best orientation with it. I think I would have struggled. And like, I still think I'll struggle with children. That's no question, but yeah, there's something there's something about the extra years and that coming to terms with that reframing that I feel grateful that I have before it starts. Does that make any sense?
It very much does. I think it's good to not just accept but embrace the path that you're on. Because I think essentially everyone can look at their life and say, oh, maybe if I had known then what I know now, I would have made different choices. I would have spent my money differently, spent my time differently, spent, stood up to that person sooner, ended that relationship sooner, whatever. But I think that saying, no, this is the path you're on, and you're on it. And even moving away from the sort of the analysis of like, oh, is it good or bad? Could I have done it better or different? I'm like, what's the value of that?
Yeah.
Seriously, what's the value of that? There's no value there.
Mm.
And instead to say, this is the path that God has put me on, and there's beauty here that I wouldn't find on another path. And most importantly, this, the way that you live your life is your conversation with God and his conversation with you. And so it's going to be different, and it will have its own things that are ugly and beautiful. And it's not a thing to be assessed the way that we assess, like a cake recipe. Like, well, should we tweak it and add more eggs next time? Like, it's a different kind of thing.
Yeah, the eggs are in. There's no
eggs
change in it.
Yeah, it's cooked. I think that another thing is, as a society, we have mostly divorced the ideas of life and death. And we have somehow come up with this idea of things that are just like purely life, purely good. And this is actually one of the things that I learned from my husband, who does this very well. But most of life is bittersweet. Most of the time, almost all of the time, life and death come hand in hand. Something has to die if something's going to live. And that comes on the small scale. Like if you're going to spend time with one friend, it won't be with another. Or if you spend time with all of them together, it's not one-on-one time. Like something dies for something to live. And so every time you do it, do you do anything, there's something that will be a sacrifice, and there's no avoiding it. And if you do nothing, that's also sacrifice. Like there's no avoiding it. There's always these little deaths. And even in the best things in life, like even my kids, right? I'm so proud of them. I'm so happy that they're maturing into like teenagers who have their own like whatever. But they're not toddlers anymore. And I miss my toddlers. I miss having babies. I loved that so much, and I loved having babies, and I don't have any, and I won't have any more unless the Lord provides a miracle. But I don't have babies, and I have teenagers, but in some ways, the children that I had, I'll never have again. And there's some sense of continuity. They're the same people, but the babies I had are in some sense dead. They're gone. And so I would always make that choice, because for the children to grow up and have life, those old aspects of them had to die. But even in the process of positive growth towards maturity, there's a loss. Even in the best things, there's always loss. And so I think that part of what's really hard is we live in a world where there's sort of this idea that you can just have good without loss. And learning that in all things, everything is bittersweet. And just trying to ignore the bitter and only taste the sweet just cheapens it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, our culture is obsessed with avoiding death, or pushing it as far away as possible. Like it bleeds into the medical industry. You see it in the beauty trends. It's all about like life and youth and holding on to this avoidance of death. But like at least in the Christian story, there's this pattern of death in life, and that the willingness to accept death to have life. So yeah, I really like that point, and sort of the recognition of like every day is full of little deaths, but like we have to go through those things to gain life, and life that's more meaningful. Well, we're getting close to the time. Is there anything else that you want to say, or that we haven't we haven't talked about that you think would be important?
No, I feel like I said at the beginning, it's such a huge topic. We
I
could probably
know,
talk about it for like another 8 hours and still have
I
things to
know.
say. But I'm just really glad that you reached out and we got to talk, and I'd love to talk again sometime. And
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, any questions for me? I've I've asked you lots of questions.
no, no, I think if I was going to ask anything, I would poke in a little more. Like you brought up the fact a couple times that, you know, you're newly married and so you're thinking about marriage in new ways. But I do feel like if we open that up, that's probably like at least another hour of talking. So
Well, probably, well, maybe it depends. Um, yeah. I mean, yeah, life is just like in some ways it doesn't feel that different. You know, got married in uh October. Gosh, I can't even remember when I got married anymore. This is a problem. Uh got married in October, so it's still fairly new. So in some ways it feels like not much has changed, yet also knowing like everything has fundamentally changed. And I know there's a lot of big changes coming up. And so yeah, I think I'm in that limbo stage where it's, that it's fundamentally changed and like the thing that you had is gone. But like what's to come and what will be, like there's no certainty about that. And there's an acknowledgement of, you know, some sense of what that is, but nothing is ever what you imagine it to be. And so
mhm,
I'm in many ways it's bittersweet. Like you mourn the loss and you kind of wrestle with the path of like, okay, well, what does this mean for the future? Um, but yeah, there's also that like hope and that beauty and that recognition of like, yeah, there's going to be a lot of a lot of pain and a lot of frustration and definitely sleepless nights. But like yeah, finding ways to sort of ground myself and like prepare myself for those things, I think is um yeah, I think the thing that I'm trying my best to get my mind around and figure out like, well, how do I put those little practices in place now so that like they become patterns that aren't so easily abandoned or tossed away or left. And
mhm,
I'm trying to find that balance too, because I am a bit of an extreme person.
mhm,
So it's like when I do something, it's like I want to like rehaul everything and like totally rewrite whatever. And the recognition throughout the years of saying, well, that is not the best way to do things. Often it's small steps and the belief and trust that, discipline breeds more discipline, and like taking the small steps of the practices open the space to take on more when you're ready. So that's just like the mindset I'm trying to get in, where I'm a like I run at things and throw myself into the deep end, and even when you don't know how to swim, right? And so like learning of like, hey, there might be there might be a simpler way to do this. Uh yeah, but that's how it feels for me, I think, in that, yeah, in this like place where I'm at. Um but yeah, definitely, I mean, it's just so hard to think about. And I think we talk about like the marriage crisis, especially like in the frame of men, but women are going through that too. And sometimes, and I think it's in some ways, it's going to be a harder wake up call for women, particularly because of the biological aspect of, we just have a smaller window, like to have children and all of those things than men do generally. And so
mhm.
yeah, that's sort of the other part of this I'm thinking about, of like, yeah, how is that gonna
affect the generation, and especially for those who it hasn't hit yet.
Mhm.
I don't know. But maybe that's another conversation. I'll have to have you back and we can we can talk about this again.
Yeah, either recorded or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot there to talk about. I would say with marriage, the two things I would say to anyone who's newly married would be learn how to forgive really fast. The faster you can apologize and forgive, the better. Because especially like the first 7 years, I think that's the big adjustment period, I think. So that requires a lot of humility. So working on building that. And forgiveness requires humility too. But then the other thing would be to really like cultivate enjoyment of the good and the beautiful things, whatever you can see that's good and beautiful within the marriage. Genuinely enjoy it. Don't just think like, oh, I should be grateful, but like create the space to like savor and enjoy whatever parts of it you love. Because the more you attend to it and enjoy it, the more those things will grow. And so it seems selfish because you're like, what, I'm just going to sit around and enjoy the things I like. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what you should do.
Yeah. It's so simple, but so true. Well, thanks, Kathryn. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, it was good to talk.
Thank you so much for watching. As always, I will close with serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.